Picture this. You're being held at gunpoint in a bank along with three other hostages. Your captor is a convicted felon who was let out early on parole. He's already shot at a police officer and is unwilling to negotiate with anyone. Eventually, he is captured and taken to trial, but you refuse to testify against him in court. This is a story of one of the strangest crimes in Sweden's history. Let's take a moment and talk about it. Hello, and welcome back to Moment of Zen, a podcast about everything and nothing. I'm your host, as always, Johnson Zen. And before we begin, I have a few announcements that I want to make. The first is that this story takes place in Sweden, and I'm not Swedish, so I will be pronouncing everything wrong, like the typical American I am. The second is that there may or may not be an episode next week. So right now I'm currently working on a really fun and interesting Halloween special. It will be released on the normal Tuesday schedule, hopefully. So expect it to come out on the 30th. And depending on how far I get with that special, I may or may not have time next week to record an episode. So I just want to apologize in advance. But like I said, season 2 is going to be full of surprises, and I hope you all are ready. And with that said, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe if you're enjoying this podcast. Thank you all so much. Let's jump straight in. As many of you can already tell by the title of this episode, today I will be talking about Stockholm Syndrome and the events that led up to one of Sweden's most infamous hostage crises in their history. To begin with, what exactly is Stockholm Syndrome? So, psychologists define Stockholm Syndrome as the psychological condition where hostages develop an emotional bonding or sympathy towards their captors. Some common examples of this are people who join cults and become sympathetic to their cult leaders, or women in abusive relationships but choose to stay with their partners. I think what made this incident in Stockholm so interesting was that the entire thing was televised, so we saw everything as it developed and unfolded. With cults or abusive relationships, the psychological transformation sort of happens over a longer period of time, and most of the time, the entire ordeal occurs in private. So that was just a little background about Stockholm Syndrome. Now let's talk about the hostage crisis that the condition is named after. But before we do that, let's first introduce a few people that will be important in this story. The first person is a man named Jan Erik Olsen, and I just want to say that I tried my best when it came to researching more about Olsen, but after about going into the 15th page of Google, there really isn't a lot of information about Olsen and his early life. The only information that I was able to gather about Olsen was that he was born in southwestern Sweden in 1941. So on Wikipedia, it says that he was born in Ekeby, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong. But on an interview he did for a Swedish newspaper, that was obviously translated from Swedish into English, it said that he was born in Helsingborg. So Ekeby and Helsingborg are about 21 kilometers or 13 miles apart. So I don't really think it really matters where he was born. He was just kind of born around that. Just know that he was born around the southwestern Sweden area. Also in that interview, Olsen said that his family was very poor growing up because he had been born during the Second World War and grew up post-war when Europe was sort of in shambles and still rebuilding. And he said that as a child, he would get into a lot of trouble and he would start up fires up and down the street and was just a sort of troublemaker in his neighborhood. So Olson was a sort of career criminal and he had gotten into a lot of trouble with the law multiple times even before the hostage crisis. He had been convicted several times for different violent crimes. I believe most of these convictions were assaults. So in prison, Olson meets a man named Clark Olfson, who becomes very important later on. And FYI, I'm just gonna call him Clark because his last name is very similar to Olson's, and I don't want to get them mixed up. But now let's talk a little bit more about Clark Olofsson. Of course, since Olson meets Clark in prison, Clark must be an outstanding citizen. So Clark was born into a family of alcoholics. I don't really know what year he was born, but he was raised with a single mother who wasn't really able to give Clark and his two siblings enough attention and care since she worked long hours to support her three children. The lack of adult supervision led Clark to start committing petty crimes as a teenager. He was eventually caught for these crimes and he was sent to a correctional facility where he escaped about 2 years later. After he escaped from prison, he entered the then Prime Minister Taj Erlander's country estate and stole fruit and vegetables from his greenhouse. I mean, hey, when you're out on the run from the cops, you got to get your daily fruits and veggies because it's tough on the body. So he was sent back to prison again, obviously. But this was after he had assaulted two police officers 9 months after his initial escape. After he was sent to prison, he escapes again, and this time he's involved in a burglary in a bike shop near Nyköping. This guy's, this guy's just being, your model prisoner and outstanding citizen right now. So finally, he was caught again after a few more burglaries and was sent to a prison near Kalmar, where he meets our good friend Olson. The two, Olson and Clark, quickly become friends in prison, and in August of 1973, Olson is granted a leave from prison. So I'm not sure if this is the same as being set out on parole, but right before his leave from prison, Olson and Clark devise a plan to get Clark released from prison. And the plan was for Olson to rob a bank and use that as leverage to demand Clark's release. So this brings us to the morning of August 23rd. At around 10 a.m. August 23rd, 1973, Olson walks into the Sveriges Kreditbanken, a bank in Normanstad Square in central Sweden. And underneath his jacket, Olson has a hidden submachine gun. And as he enters into the bank, he pulls out the gun and fires several shots into the ceiling. As he's firing his gun, he shouts in English, quote, "The party the party has just begun. The party has just begun." So the source I'm reading this from says that he said that phrase, "the party has just begun," in an American accent to try to disguise his voice. So to me, this is really funny because as an American, this is something I think a typical American would do, in a bank robbery. But jokes aside, of course, right after Olson shoots his gun into the ceiling, a silent police alarm is signaled, and the police were right on their way. Two Swedish police officers arrive at the scene first, and they go inside the bank to try to scope out the situation. Olsen sees these two officers and immediately fires at them, injuring one of the officers on the hand. Knowing that he couldn't outlast the police officers in a gunfight, Olsen takes four people hostage. Three of them were bank tellers, and the other was a bank customer who was found hiding in one of the storerooms. In total, it was three women and one man, and their names are Birgitte Lundblad, Kristen Enmark, Elizabeth Oldgren, and Sven Sefstrom. After taking the hostages, Olsen then begins making his demands. He demands 3 million Swedish krona, which is about $700,000 USD. Adjusted for inflation, that would be roughly $4 million today. In addition to the money, he also asks for two guns, a bulletproof vest, and a getaway car. And most importantly, that his friend Clark Olofsson would be released from prison. A few hours later, the police deliver on his ransom, and they bring Clark, the money, and a blue Ford Mustang to the bank. Seizing the opportunity, Olsen demands that the hostages have to go with him in the car in order to ensure his safe passage. The police, of course, refuse this since the original terms of the negotiation was to trade his ransom for the hostages. So after negotiations fall through, Olsen forces his hostages into the bank vault and refuses any more communication between him and the police. Clark then becomes Olsen and the police's liaison and helps to form a bridge of communication between Olsen and the police. Now things get a little strange. Inside the cramped bank vault, Olsen develops a friendly relationship with the hostages, and based on their accounts, Kristen Enmark said that Olsen had draped a jacket over her when she began to shiver from the cold and comforted her when she was having a bad dream. He also gave her a bullet from his gun as a keepsake. Elizabeth Oldred said that he thought it was very kind of Olsen to allow her to walk outside the bank vault because of her claustrophobia, even though she was leashed on a rope to prevent her from escaping. So by the next day, Olsen had developed a very friendly relationship with the rest of the hostages, and they began to fear the police more than they did Olsen. The police commissioner, he was given permission to go into the vault and to inspect the health of the hostages. And when he gets there, sort of to his surprise, he sees that the hostages were very relaxed around Olsen and Clark, but they quickly became hostile towards him. At around noon on the second day, the then Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, was called. Clark took the call and threatened the Prime Minister that all of the hostages would be killed if Olsen's demands weren't going to be met. The Prime Minister was in a sort of very sticky political situation at that time, since in 1973 it was an election year for Sweden, and on top of that, he was in the middle of a memorial service for Sweden's king, Gustav Adolf VI. On the third day, police devised a plan to drill a hole into the wall of the bank and release tear gas to force everyone out. And as I mentioned earlier, the entire ordeal was televised and broadcast all throughout Sweden. And what ended up happening was that the plan police had come up with was also broadcast to everyone on the radio. Whether it was intentional or accidental by journalists, I really don't know. Olsen and Clark and the hostages, of course, they listened to the radio and heard the entire broadcast, and this infuriated Olsen. He threatened to shoot one of the hostages' legs to try to shake up the police. And in an interview with the New Yorker, Sven told reporters that he thought it was kind of Olsen to only consider shooting him in his leg. He also told reporters that Kristen had also tried to convince him to take the bullet in the leg, and he quotes her as saying, quote, "But Sven, it's just the leg," end quote. So back in the vault, the Prime Minister calls again, but this time, instead of Clark answering to him on the phone, Kristen picks up and she talks with the Prime Minister. And to the Prime Minister's surprise, she pleads with him to allow Olsen and Clark to take her with them in their getaway car. And here's a quote from her to the Prime Minister. Quote, "I fully trust Clark and the robber. I'm not desperate. They haven't done a thing to us. On the contrary, they have been very nice. But you know, Olaf, what I am scared of is that the police will attack and cause us to die." End quote. It was also noted that Kristen tells the Prime Minister that she had scolded one of the hostages, who we now know is Sven, for being afraid to take a bullet to the leg so that the police would take the situation much more seriously. So, despite the threats against the hostages, the police proceeded to drill the hole into the main vault from the apartment above the bank. As the hole was being drilled, Clark fired his gun at the ceiling towards the hole on two separate occasions. And on one of these occasions, he ends up injuring one of the police officers in the hand and face. Another 2 days pass, and on the fifth day, August 28th, the police decide to use tear gas to force everyone out of the vault. So after the tear gas was pumped into the vault through the small hole, Olsen and Clark surrendered to the police about half an hour later. Upon their surrender, the police ordered that Olsen and Clark release the hostages first, but Kristen vehemently refused, stating that, quote, "No, Jan and Clark go first. You'll gun them down if we do," end quote. Police then stormed the vault with gas masks on and apprehended both Clark and Olsen. And as they were being handcuffed and taken to custody, the hostages shouted to the police to not hurt them and that they didn't do anything to hurt them. And as Kristen was taken to an ambulance, she is seen shouting at Clark, quote, "I'll see you again," end quote. So after about 130 hours of negotiations, the Normanstrog robbery and hostage crisis was over. Both Olsen and Clark were charged with robbery and kidnapping, but the kidnapping charges were all dropped since none of the four hostages were willing to testify against Olsen or Clark. Clark, he claimed in court that he was not an accomplice to the bank robbery and that he was only there to try to save the hostages by keeping the situation calm. Obviously, this didn't go well for him in court, and he was convicted for the robbery on top of his prior sentence. Olsen, on the other hand, he was only given a 10-year sentence for his attempted bank robbery, which to me is pretty crazy considering everything that happened. So while in prison, both Clark and Olsen were frequently visited by all four of the ex-hostages. Kristen, in particular, she became very close with Clark, and it's been noted that they became very good friends. Olsen, he received a lot of fan letters from many people, especially women, who found him to be attractive. He would later get engaged to one of his admirers following his release, and sort of contrary to popular belief, he did not marry one of his ex hostages. And one of the strangest things to come out of the incident that sort of seemed to perplex many people, especially psychologists, was the seemingly irrational attachment the hostages seemed to have with their captors. So, the day following her release, Elizabeth asked a psychiatrist if there was something wrong with her for not sort of harboring any ill will against her captors, Olson and Clark. Her psychiatrist, he didn't really have an answer to give her, and he basically sort of tried to compare that experience that she was having to the PTSD soldiers would get in battle, and argued that maybe the hostages became emotionally indebted to their abductors for sparing their lives. To this day, there's still a lot of controversy and debate as to what exactly caused the hostages to become so emotionally attached to their captors. The idea of brainwashing was also thrown into the mix, but nothing was ever really proven or substantiated. The term Stockholm Syndrome was used by a Swedish criminologist and psychiatrist, Niels Beyer-Roe, to describe the psychological condition the hostages experienced while being held in captivity. He originally called it the Normanström Syndrome, but it was known to everyone else outside of Sweden as Stockholm Syndrome. That is the story of the Normanström bank robbery and hostage crisis, as well as the origins of Stockholm Syndrome. Just a quick reminder that there may or may not be an episode next week. And with that, thank you all so much for tuning in. This has been your Moment of Zen. And until next time, take care and stay fresh. See ya!